Amazing. Welcome, everyone. Y'all's responses to our little check-in question made me smile, and I needed to smile today. I know many of us spent several weeks and months at the Capitol learning about working on really important issues facing public education, educators, students, and family in Texas, and really delighted that y'all are joining us today to review the 2023 Texas legislative session and talk about the new education policies and what they mean for our Texas schools. So grateful that y'all are joining us today. We know we have a very diverse group, including school leaders, policymakers and staff, advocates, youth, and so very, very grateful that you are joining us. Looking forward to engaging. We do have the chat open, so please post questions and we'll be reserving a significant amount of time, about 20 minutes at the end, to answer them and engage in dialogue. We're really looking forward to digging in to this session with y'all. I'm Paige Duggins-Clay. I'm IDRA's Chief Legal Analyst, and my goodness, I get to hang out today with my wonderful friend and colleague, Dr. Chloe Latham Sikes. Do you want to say hello, Chloe?
Hi, good afternoon, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Chloe Latham Sikes. I'm the Deputy Director of Policy at IDRA, and I work alongside Paige in concert with our team and the rest of the organization at IDRA on our Texas statewide policy priorities.
Thanks, Chloe. Because you're here, we are assuming you know a little bit about IDRA and who we are and what we do, but just in case, we'll remind you, we're a nonprofit civil rights organization dedicated to achieving equal educational opportunity for all students through strong public schools that prepare students for excellence after graduation. We have been doing this work for 50 years. Literally, it's our 50th anniversary, and we're really, really proud of that legacy. And this legislative session and so many other things happening in our society and our world just reaffirmed our commitment to pursuing our vision for strong public schools. I'll take just a moment and say thank you. I'm looking at the participant list. So many folks who share our vision for public education, working alongside us this legislative session. Looking forward to your insights in the Q&A and in the chat. And here's what we're going to do today in terms of our webinar. First, we're going to review a little bit about IDRA's policy priorities and how we approach this session. We are going to then move into a conversation about some specific bills that were passed, and we'll sort of talk about them according to by topic, based on our policy priorities and how we approach them. And we'll talk candidly about what the implications of those bills might be for next school year. And again, with the real focus on implementation and how we can continue to support educators, students, and families in having high quality public education.
Thanks, Paige. So as Paige just alluded to, there were certainly many, many bills passed or had some close calls that address and touch on pre-K and K through 12 public education in Texas. We are going to focus on a few of the highlights for bills we were watching very closely that either passed or got quite close, and some of the implications around that of what we might be seeing according to our 5 policy priority areas. These are on our website. You're welcome to view them there. This presentation, by the way, is going to be sent out to everyone who attended, all registrants of the webinar, and posted on our website. So you'll be able to come back to it for resources and information. But our 5 priorities for this past legislative session were securing fair school funding for public schools, ensuring excellent educational opportunities for emergent bilingual, formerly known as English learner students, promoting culturally sustaining schools, creating safer schools without harmful discipline, and preparing all students to succeed in college. These priorities pretty much run the gamut of what goes on in K through 12 schools and policies that affect them. So again, this is not an exhaustive overview of every single item of legislation, but we are certainly curious and interested in your thoughts. And these, again, are some of the major highlights pertaining to these areas. I'm going to kick us off with a couple of notes on fair school funding. So one of the key areas for public schools, and actually one of the legacy founding issues for IDRA, is ensuring and securing fair school funding for public schools. So this has meant ensuring adequacy and equity in our fair school funding system, and ensuring that areas that are not able to generate as much local revenue are able to have guaranteed and equalized funding levels, and that we're putting in both more money into the system to invest in our public schools and our students, as well as having targeted types of funding that affect student success, such as in bilingual education, compensatory education, other specific programs that are going to affect the equity of school funding. So that is really core to the mission of IDRA. What do we see in this year's budget coming out of the session? We saw a little over $48 billion budgeted for in the Foundation Schools program. This is the program area that really houses the funding formula for public schools. So when you hear about per pupil funding and attendance funding and schools getting the amount of money that, according to the students that attend schools, we're talking about what's really operating within this program. This was actually a decrease by about $3 billion from the last 2-year budget cycle. And you may have heard there might be more money attributed to schools, or the state's putting more money towards schools. There's a lot wrapped up in that. But when we're really talking about the Foundation Schools program, we saw a $3 billion decrease. In part, I think this is going to be from in anticipation of the COVID-19 ESSER relief funds drying up in the next biennium and the next 2-year budget cycle beginning in 2024. There are a lot of expenditure limits that those monies must be spent by September 1st of 2024. So those were not going to be available for that future budgeting cycle. So we saw a little less funding to keep up with just the basics of what we have built into our structure of how we fund schools and provide that funding to students. We did see, and this is where that more money to schools conversation might come, we've seen that a little bit in the media or from state leaders, $1.4 billion allotted for school safety grants and initiatives. These are particularly around the allowable uses, like the increase for shields and different types of hardening facilities, facilities infrastructure under school safety. Paige is going to talk a lot more about that with the school safety legislation that passed and how this pertains to that. But essentially, there were existing grant structures, and they infused $1.4 billion towards those grants and initiatives that schools are going to apply for if they want to be able to use it for those specified uses in school, the school safety umbrella. But that's not exactly formula funding that's per student. That is a grant program with specific uses. We're going to spend most of our time on this talking about what happened between January and Memorial Day of this year, but we are also right now in the second day of the second special session. The Texas governor can call a special session at their discretion. It lasts up to 30 days, and so far we've had back-to-back sessions. So right after that regular session ended on May 29th, they went into a first special session to talk about property tax cuts. That just ended on Monday, and on Tuesday we jumped right on in, or excuse me, ended on Tuesday, and yesterday was the first day jumping into the second special session. So we're actually continuing to be in this cycle with some named targeted priorities, primarily around tax compression. We're not going to go super deep into this, but essentially the legislators did agree to put aside over $17 billion of the budget for property tax cuts. That's going to mean not necessarily more money to schools, but just changes where that money comes from local property taxpayers, or from other state revenue sources. So tax compression is about the conversation to literally compress, to reduce the amount of local property tax rate for school districts, and instead to offset that funding into other state revenue sources. There's a lot wrapped up in this because there are not necessarily designated or promised state revenue sources to provide that, to provide the difference in that funding. So that doesn't mean that there's more funding for schools, so there's promised increases for schools. It actually means there's going to be a reduction in funding overall, and it reduces local districts' ability and local communities' ability to determine how much funding they want to be able to raise for their local schools. So there's a lot here. There's a lot of different ways to do that. And so this is what we're currently seeing in our second special session. Changes where the money comes from doesn't mean more money to schools. What did happen? or rather what didn't happen. Really, this slide is that was what did happen. This is what didn't happen for fair school funding. So in public school funding, there were several proposals that put forward some types of increases to that per pupil funding foundation, the basic allotment, made changes to adjust it for inflation, which is not currently the case and hasn't been. But these all went down with the sinking ship, which we did also advocate for, which was declining and rejecting any proposals for private school voucher programs, which take public funds and put them into private educational services. So these in the end became tied together in the legislative proposals in the final days, literally the final day of the legislative session. So while vouchers did not advance, which IDRA advocated against and celebrated that those did not become law this past session, we also saw no type of meaningful investment or even nominal investment in the changes to increase public school funding. So we have no student funding increases, so those per student funding increases, no adjustments for inflation, no teacher raises for current teachers, no private school voucher programs. These became married together. Two pieces of legislation were really in the final days, coming down to how they were tied together. One was House Bill 100, which would have raised the basic allotment by what by many measures was still too little an amount, but nonetheless would have raised the basic allotment. That's again that per student funding that drives the rest of the school funding formula. And it did tie some other allotments to enrollment-based funding, which would also increase the total amount of funding provided for those targeted programs. In that proposal, it included special education funding, bilingual education funding, compensatory education funding, which is for students from low-income and educationally disadvantaged backgrounds as defined in law, and would have increased the actual weights of how those are calculated as well for some of those. It had a lot of other moving parts to it, but in the end, that was the primary public school funding bill. And it got enmeshed with Senate Bill 8, which was the primary private school voucher proposal that got legs and moved the farthest through this process. This would give an $8,000 per student participant voucher to students to use for private educational services without any type of reporting, requiring a waiver of parents to sign away their federal protections and understand that they would be signing their federal special education protections and language access protections by having their student participate. Lots of other things here. It had about a $500 million price tag over the course of just 2 years with anticipated growth. So there was in the budget to begin with for a $500 million private school voucher program, but it was contingent on that legislation passing, and no other investments for public schools were made because of that going down. So again, those did not pass. We will likely see these proposals again in future legislative sessions. Again, I said we're in the second special session. We're anticipating several, and that's been announced. And we think that we're going to see these types of proposals again, likely in the fall. Our second priority area, I know I spent a little bit of time on funding because there are a few moving parts there. Our second priority area is ensuring excellent educational opportunities for emergent bilingual students. What does this mean? This means supporting bilingual teacher workforce. This means supporting training for all educators around bilingual education and the importance of that and how to be culturally affirming and sustaining in their work with emergent bilingual students and their families. And it also means high quality materials and as well as high quality programs. So everything that goes into developing a high quality bilingual program, including the expansion of dual language programs. There was an excellent strategic plan that the state agency, the Texas Education Agency, released in January. That was from a bill from the previous session. And it's a strategic plan to improve and expand high quality bilingual education for emergent bilingual students. It contains 8 legislative recommendations. There was some great legislation out of that moved through the process, but unfortunately, none of it crossed the finish line. So that contained supports for bilingual teacher workforce, recruitment pipeline, retention pipeline, as well as other educator training, some other funding that would affect the bilingual education allotment. Some really excellent proposals that the agency put forward, and none, unfortunately, went all the way through. This is additionally unfortunate because much of last year was also spent with the Texas Education Agency hosted the teacher vacancy task force, and they issued a report. This was assembled by dozens of teachers and administrators and other educators that had been appointed to the task force last spring to determine what are some real interventions to address Texas's teacher shortage? And they put forth some really meaningful recommendations in their final report, also on the TEA website. And some specifically called out bilingual teacher supports because this is an acute shortage area of over 30 years in Texas. We've had a 30-year long teacher shortage in bilingual and ESL education. So there were no new supports taken up from either of these reports that were both developed by thousands of stakeholders, thousands of hours, and rubber stamped by the Texas Education Agency, as well as many communities and educators across Texas. So that was very unfortunate. And we'll continue monitoring and trying to put forward that legislation and future opportunities. One shining star here is that there is an item in the budget that provides a tuition assistance program for aspiring teachers getting certified in bilingual ESL education as well in Spanish language education. It's pretty limited. It was limited to 7 university preparation programs. It's been expanded to an additional 5 with greater statewide representation, with also commensurate annual average funding. So there's more money in the budget and expanded to more universities to be able to support their aspiring teachers in this really high need field. And I will kick it to Paige to speak about our third priority area.
Thanks, Chloe, and thanks for that wonderful landscape around those core issues. And we'll move to this one, promoting culturally sustaining schools. This is very important to IDRA's mission and to the broader operation of equal opportunity for all kiddos. And we unfortunately have continued to see attacks on all sorts of policies, practices, and people that help support students, help them feel safe, and make sure that our schools are welcoming, inclusive places regardless of their background and their identity. We will flag, I'm going to flag here on the left some information about some of the continued efforts to build on SB3 and the K-12 censorship that we saw in the last legislative session and subsequent special sessions. And then we'll talk about some other adjacent issues that are relevant to this area of work. First and foremost, we saw yet another effort to censor the materials and information available to kids and educators in our public school classrooms. House Bill 900, piece of legislation that very comprehensive, but at its core, it's really designed to create even more infrastructure and systems to place restrictions on book vendors and school libraries. And so really building on a lot of what was happening at the local level, where we were seeing book challenges and books being removed from classroom libraries and from school-based libraries. This bill, purports to give a framework for how schools do that. It, in a very novel way, it places restrictions on book vendors. And so by regulating book vendors and requiring them to put ratings on book materials that flow from concepts that purport to be around getting obscene content out of libraries and out of schools. But we know that local policymakers, a small group of parents and community members have really construed the meaning of obscene to be encompassing of all sorts of perspectives, viewpoints, and identities, including a direct attack on LGBTQ+ communities, books, and expressions, and relatedly, an attack on books that uplift and affirm the stories and perspectives of Black and other communities of color. And so this is really about, and there was a lot of testimony in the legislative session about the harmful and chilling impact of this legislation. So we will be monitoring implementation of that. We are already seeing some districts removing books from shelves, even without these ratings being in place yet. Again, that has been a trend that has been occurring for some time. A report by PEN America showing that Texas leads the way across the nation in the number of books removed from our schools and public library shelves. And so very concerned about that, and very important to ensure that our libraries are reflective of the identities and perspectives of all of our students and communities, and that they're not targeted based on their viewpoint. Chloe, do you want to talk briefly about House Bill 1605 and how that is related to this broader effort to censor public school materials?
Yes, thanks, Paige. And I will be brief. House Bill 1605 was considered the one item of legislation that did come out of that teacher vacancy task force recommendations for high quality instructional materials. The intent of this, the purported intent of this, is to reduce the planning time that teachers need to undergo in order to identify and procure instructional materials for their students. It got wrapped up in a lot of different conversations about being a vendor bill, that it is targeted toward the Amplify Texas materials. And essentially what it does is it does create a state-approved instructional materials list that has about almost an $800 million price tag for districts then to be able to purchase those materials and use them specifically for to be aligned with the Texas standards. So there's a variety of ways these materials will be categorized, whether they 100% align to the TEKS, the Texas Learning Standards, or partially align at 50%, but they will be reviewed by the state board. It also creates an open educational resource repository and advisory board to review those materials. And so there was a lot of conversation about the quality, the nature of these, the selection, how the TEA is going to contract these materials. And the reason that we at IDRA are concerned is not only for quality materials, we're always looking at wanting high quality and affirming materials to support curricula and high quality academic learning in schools. But this also contained incentives to comply with these censorship bill of 2021 in the second special of 2021. These were considered the prohibited or the divisive concepts that really heavily restricted classroom conversations on race, gender, oppression, the origins of slavery in the United States. These are concepts that weren't part of the learning standards, but they're how these issues could be talked about in schools. They're very vaguely written concepts that are not to be discussed in schools, and it really limited teachers' ability, as a lot of news reporting showed, to discuss salient issues and current events and history around race, around gender identity, around sexual preference and identity, and other types of issues such as reproductive issues and current events pertaining to that. All sorts of a range of issues that pertain to students' identity and lived experience, and what's going on in the day-to-day, and teachers feeling censored in being able to discuss those and teach them in their actual coursework. This bill contains some incentives to comply with those concepts, essentially. Those concepts didn't otherwise have any enforcement. There was not a different type of checking mechanism or how those concepts then translated into censoring instructional materials or textbooks, aside from book bans, which have gotten a lot of attention. This takes that a step further in really incentivizing how the instructional materials are going to, it signals those approved instructional materials are going to be heavily censored according to interpretations of those, again, very vaguely and that sometimes contradictory concepts that are as a result of last session. So this is concerning, and we're going to be watching how these take off and how these are utilized. But that's why we also are considering this in essence a censorship bill because of that.
Thanks, Chloe. And as y'all can see, my cat Margot has decided to join this important conversation. She loves talking about schools. Moving over to the right side of this slide, the other sort of issue that became really snowballed this session was really about the religious influence, the influence of religion in schools. This has really grown out of advocacy happening at the local level, bolstered by recent decisions by the U.S. Supreme Court, including the Kennedy versus Bremerton decision, which many of you will recall is a decision about a coach and the role of prayer in public school and the place for prayer in public school. Building on that decision, some advocates really push for policies that enshrine religious practices in our schools. And of course, all students should be valued, respected, and have space to practice their religion as they need to and as they see fit. But it's very, very concerning when we begin to see schools enshrining particular religions or religious practices or upholding some over others. We want these to be welcoming, inclusive environments for all students. SB 763 did pass this session. And it's very concerning. It allows for religious chaplains to act in the role of a public school counselor. And the language evolved a little bit through the process, but this really grew out. There was an acknowledgement going into the session, and we'll talk about this more a little bit in the school safety context. There's a clear need, right, for increased mental health supports and resources, including school-based mental health supports and resources. And so there's no denying that, but a significant challenge here is that religious chaplains are not trained, right, to serve the particular functions of school counselors who perform not only school-based mental health services, but perform a whole host of other very important educational functions, including counseling students on academic needs, extracurricular needs, access to higher education and their pathway. And so very important roles. This bill now allows chaplains to fulfill it. And we're very concerned that chaplains will be taking the roles of these school counselors. We know that a significant amount of Texas children do not have access to a licensed school counselor in their school. And so very, very concerned about watching implementation of that. Here's a close call that, again, gets even closer to the blurring of the lines between church and state. SB 1515 would have required the display of the 10 Commandments in our public school classrooms to the extent that it was donated. A poster or a picture of the commandments was donated to a school for display. This grows on a piece of legislation that also passed last session, advanced by the same group, backed by an organization called Patriot Mobile, which displayed the national model, "In God We Trust," and those posters that were displayed around public schools. There's been a lot of really excellent media coverage around that. This really would have taken it a step further and generated outcry from a whole host of interfaith and civil rights and First Amendment advocates and organizations, including in addition to education specialists and groups, and really would have presented concerning questions, right? Which version of the 10 Commandments, for example, should be displayed? There was a lot of conversation and testimony about that. How would we possibly prepare and expect educators to be able to talk about the role of the 10 Commandments in a non-biased way, in a way that feels inclusive and representative of all students? And what is the inclusion of this, or what does this policy statement say about one religion that was advocating for the display of this religious text to the exclusion of other religions and other sacred and important texts that are not being prioritized and displayed? And so that bill did not pass, but it has been reintroduced at least once in the first special session, and we expect to see this to come back again. So now we'll move to a sobering conversation. Both Chloe and I are parents, and we should have said that, and have educators in our family. I'm the child of a 30+ year educator. And so school safety is critically important to us, and as a person who has kiddos in our schools. And this session was a really, really challenging. It's the first session, of course, following the tragedy in Uvalde. We knew going in, based on some of the interim hearings and, of course, the media moving up, and the really excellent advocacy by Uvalde and many of the other surviving communities of gun violence in our schools. And it really presented a lot of challenges. And unfortunately, the legislature really missed critical opportunities to make really important investments and advancements in school safety, and instead prioritize harmful practices that are really making our schools less safe. But let's start with the positive, because some good things did happen. We're really, really proud and pleased that HB 567, or the Crown Act, was passed and was actually signed by the governor just a couple of weeks ago. The Crown Act is an amazing piece, an important piece of legislation that has gained traction across the country, that prohibits adverse action, including discipline, for individuals based on their hair texture and style, when that hair texture or hairstyle is connected, historically to your race or ethnicity. We have all seen, I think, the horror stories and the media coverage of students being forced to cut their dreadlocks in order to participate in a wrestling match, or not being allowed to wear particular hairstyles or hair accessories based on that are connected to their ethnicity or even their religious faith. And so this law provides really important safeguards and statements of affirmation for students that they are welcome to come into their educational spaces and be their authentic selves without being faced with harmful discipline. In addition, the No Kids in Cuffs Act, SB 133, that was led by Senator West, and was a reintroduction of this bill this session, and that passed. And this is another, again, very important piece of legislation, making an important strides in student civil rights. It prevents the physical or chemical use of restraint on kids, on young children, I think below the 6th grade. And that would include things like handcuffs, pepper sprays, tasers, right? The research clearly shows that young kids are targeted, at a really concerning rate for these sorts of restraints. Students with disabilities are targeted with a grossly disproportionate rate for these sorts of really harmful practices. And of course, when you layer in and intersect race, Black students of any kind of ability, and particularly Black students with disabilities are continue to be highly overrepresented in the data around who is being targeted by these practices. So we're very glad that that has passed and look forward to its implementation. I'll fly quickly that part of the challenge of this session on school safety was that there was a real effort to focus on rhetoric that is not supported by the evidence and the research, is that's actually harmful for kids in schools. And these are narratives around the need to harden, to crack down, and to engage in sort of zero tolerance policies in order to gain compliance. We know, and we have known for decades, that these sorts of policies and practices do not work, do not make our schools safer, and ultimately destabilize and create opportunities for us to lose track of students who might ultimately need access to resources and prevent a tragedy. Some of those bills that we defeated were House Bill 655 and Senate Bill 245, and both of those involved removing students who displayed really problematic behavior and excluding them altogether from the school environment. So of course, while it's critically important that our classrooms are safe and that educators are supported and that appropriate interventions occur when kids do display problematic behavior, it's so important that we not push those kids out of schools, but instead bring them in and connect them to resources and professionals who can help meet their needs and get them back on track. And so we were glad that those bills did not pass. I'll say really briefly for time's sake, a challenge and a surprise this session was that truancy really became a big part of the conversation around school safety. And this grew in part out of the incident in Uvalde. And we were very, very glad that a strong coalition of social workers, education, justice advocates, and families advocated very effectively to push back against efforts to recriminalize truancy. We know that sending kids to court and to jail is not a way to address the behaviors underlying failure to attend school. And instead, a really good bill, House Bill 3917 by Chairman Buckley, passed. And this is a bill that would create an infrastructure for schools and families to come together with community-based organizations and support groups to create a plan to make sure that a student can be supported in getting to school and staying in school, as opposed to pushing students and parents into the criminal justice or the civil court system. And of course, many folks have heard about House Bill 3. Unfortunately, the session ended in the very last hours of, very last days of the session with a revised version of House Bill 3, which was the state signature school safety bill, which really prioritized hardening. And at the last minute included a mandate that every school campus in the state have an armed security officer. And I want to be clear that the state has issued a preference for who that armed security officer should be. It is a police officer, either municipal, a school resource officer, or some other school-based police officer. And only if a school can demonstrate that they cannot get a armed police officer, either because of funding reasons or personnel reasons, they can then take advantage of what's been dubbed the good faith exception and hire another person to be an armed security officer on campus We are deeply concerned about this and expect that many of y'all, including those of you who are parents, would feel the same way. It really creates, it allows school boards to enter into and issue a policy and enter into contracts with individuals to fulfill the security officer mandate. And so there are some lingering questions about what those appropriate qualifications are and what the standards will be to bring those people in. It of course includes the possibility that more educators will be encouraged or incentivized to carry guns on our campuses, which we know the vast majority of educators do not want, and make our schools less safe. And so we'll be monitoring implementation of that provision very, very carefully, and think that is really an unfortunate policy decision. And of course, that piece of legislation did not come with a significant increase in funding. We talked a little bit about the overall landscape of funding. One of the many problems of focusing on and emphasizing school hardening is that these measures are expensive. And there's a lot of testimony this session around the various vendors and services and technology that schools could invest in. And the legislature only increased that school safety allotment. They said it, previous law was $9.72 per student, so increased it to $10 per student, just a 28 cent raise, and then gave each campus a $15,000 per campus allotment. And so while that little bit of funding is always better to help support safe schools, not nearly enough to fulfill the safety mandates, including the armed security officer mandate and the many other aspects of House Bill 3. I'll just note the other thing about House Bill 3 that we're very concerned about is it does give TEA a lot of power and authority to, even more power and authority to regulate and review a school's compliance with school safety standards, including the possibility that a conservator could be assigned to a district that is not in compliance. This is a concerning trend that we've seen where more and more areas of educational operations where the commissioner is having the authority to assign and use a conservator, and so we'll be monitoring that as well. And of course, not enough time to dig in, but we know we're facing a mental health crisis amongst our youth. And really, really heartbreaking missed opportunity in that we did not invest any money, significant money in increasing school-based mental health care services. House Bill 98 by Representative Moody would have done that. Senate Bill 948 by Senator West would have done that. And so we were very disappointed that those did not pass, and understand that will be a priority. It will continue to be a priority going forward.
We've arrived at our fifth and final priority area, and we're about to turn to Q&A. I'll just, we've got a good highlight and then a very timely update on the legislation and some dovetailing judicial decisions on some negative aspects of what was done around higher education. So we do prepare all students to succeed in college. We focus on policies that would support that mission. There was a piece of legislation called House Bill 8 that came out of the Texas Community College Finance Commission that took place over the course of last year or more. Had a lot of student input, had student representatives in community college programs able to weigh in and help develop some recommendations and share their stories. So House Bill 8 had a number of moving parts. It had a widespread bipartisan support. The two main moving parts are that it provides outcomes-based funding for community colleges offering what is called credentials of value. And this was set forward by the Higher Education Coordinating Board in their revised and refined strategic plan. It's still 60 by 30. It's still 60 by 30, which is 60% of Texans getting a post-secondary credential by the year 2030, which is quickly noticed. But it calls them credentials of value because these are given more weight, these credentials, whether they're a certificate, whether they're a 2-year degree, whether they're working toward a 4-year degree, assign a particular wage earning potential. So the value is corresponding specifically with what is the earning potential of getting that credential. So there's outcomes-based funding based on that for 2-year colleges. More money for junior colleges in that way. and dual credit scholarships. So it does touch into the K-12 space, which is really where IDRA lives, by providing dual credit scholarships for students who come from households with a low income. So if a student in high school qualifies for free and reduced lunch, they could be identified if they're seeking dual credit opportunities to qualify for the scholarship that would help cover tuition as well as some other costs for accessing those dual credit opportunities while they're a high school student. So that does broaden the college access and rigor and coursework that could be available, particularly for low-income students in Texas high schools. That's House Bill 8. We turn to some of the concerning pieces, and these got a lot of media attention. IDRA and a coalition we helped convene, the Texas Legislative Education Equity Coalition, as well as many state and national partners, were incredibly active in opposing these two items of legislation. We could characterize this as higher education censorship and faculty restrictions. I'll kind of take it backwards because there's a little bit more to say about SB 17. Senate Bill 18 was initially touted as a 10-year ban, a ban on faculty tenure at public colleges and universities. It did not pass in that form. It isn't a ban, but it did codify a specific definition of tenure, limited the scope of some of what tenured faculty are, how they're protected, how that tenure applies to them. It codified specific performance reviews that exist at all institutions, but put them specifically in a particular format and under the supervision of the governing board of that institution of performance reviews for tenured faculty. And then in doing so, it also broadened the grounds for firing for alleged misconduct around those reviews. And so tenure is less protected. This is concerning for academic freedom purposes. It's also concerning because this was initially touted as a bill, but before it was actually filed in the legislative session, the lieutenant governor had said that he would put forward legislation that would ban tenure for faculty who taught critical race theory, which has gotten a lot of attention in the K-12 censorship conversation, but is more of a legal theory and education and academic theory that structures research and other types of scholarship at the post-secondary level across a variety of disciplines, as well as any other number of theories that pertain to race or a critical view of class or understanding of society. So because of the way tenure is restricted and weakened through this bill, it's a heavy concern has been who is going to be subject to these firings, who is going to be subject to stricter scrutiny around obtaining tenure and retaining their tenure. This was a big area of concern for faculty, for instance, who teach in Black studies departments or Mexican American or Latino studies departments because of that particular type of scrutiny of the originations of this bill. So that is affecting higher education faculty. This is not K-12, this is post-secondary, but something that could affect the diversity, not just the racial diversity of faculty at our public colleges and universities, but also the diversity of scholarship, of theories used, of academic exploration and research that's conducted at those universities. We also have Senate Bill 17. This also passed, and this was the bill that does ban offices that center on diversity, equity, and inclusion at universities, colleges and universities in Texas. The major focus here was around the word equity, and that ties in closely to, I think, today's Supreme Court decision, heavily restricting affirmative action, and Paige will say another bit about that in just a moment. This bill was a little different than how it was introduced in the version that did pass, but it does still essentially ban offices that are considered diversity, equity, and inclusion offices. And a lot of the conversation was around programs that target students based on race, their racial and ethnic identity, as well as gender. And the real massively concerning issues with this, there are multiple, that these types of offices, not only do they offer very specific programs for student success based on students who have been historically marginalized from post-secondary education, based on race, based on ethnicity, based on gender identity, as well as a whole host of other factors. But these offices also offer trainings and supports, financial, supports as well as technical assistance, guidance, they provide really the infrastructure throughout the university in academic and in extracurricular types of programs for student success programs that are targeted for students who have been historically marginalized. So this does, like I mentioned, include programs based on students' racial and ethnic identity, but also for students who are first generation attendance, college goers and graduates, students who identify in the LGBTQIA community, students who are veterans, students with disabilities. Title IX offices are often housed in the DEI office. So it's really concerning how this type of ban could fragment that umbrella of how inclusive services for student success are housed and supported and delivered on colleges at colleges and universities. Paige, do you want to say a little bit more about how this ties in with today's Supreme Court decision? And then we will have about 10 minutes for questions.
Perfect. Yeah, and if folks might have seen the news today, this morning, the U.S. Supreme Court finally issued its decision in the Harvard and the University of North Carolina affirmative action cases. And very disappointingly, but I guess not unsurprisingly, the majority opinion in a 6-3 decision overruled the use of affirmative action in higher education admissions. Obviously, that's not the subject of today's webinar, but we just want to flag that because we recognize that these efforts to censor the perspectives and views and work of faculty through things like SB 18, to disband the offices, programs, and services that recruit, retain, and support students and faculty of color and other systemically marginalized groups, that's SB 17, and now this, overarching dismantling of a longstanding, policy that allows the limited consideration of race to get diverse students into the door. Just want to acknowledge that all these fights are connected, and it's really, really critical that we think about this issue not only from the vantage point of higher education admissions, but what do we all need to do now to collectively make sure that our K-12 education is high quality, equitable, and prepare students and support students in accessing higher education, because that's really step one to ensuring that these institutions continue to support and enroll diverse students.
Thanks, Paige. And our wonderful policy strategist, Thomas, just put our statement on the Supreme Court decision in the chat. This is going to be something that we encourage you to subscribe if you want to learn more. We'll be putting out more analysis and information. And with that, we'll turn to our Q&A. I have been loosely checking the chat. I know there's been some comments and different resources, but we certainly welcome your questions.
And while folks are popping questions in the chat, I just wanted to acknowledge, Ted, you had a really great point about SB 133, the No Kids in Cuffs Act, that it does have a significant exception, which is that to the extent that a student is perceived as presenting a threat or a danger, they can be restrained in that manner. And I absolutely agree, not only in the context of the use of restraints, but in this broader climate of threat assessments, which we've seen a lot of focus on this session and before, how making sure that we implement those as schools with consideration for student civil rights and don't do that in a way that is discriminatory. So I appreciate you raising that and just wanted to uplift that point. I saw a hand raised, but it went away. Feel free to come up with mute and ask your question.
Sorry.
That's okay.
It's me. Yeah, I was talking about Senate Bill, what was it, 133? I met with the office of, my name is Columba Wilson, and I have I'm 75 years old. I have a grandson that's autistic, intellectually disabled, and a little bit in the aggressive side. I am his guardian, and he lives with me since he was 2. And I was advocating for the bill, and I told them they need to add a little bit to SAPD, because I called them for help and they handcuffed him and they took him to jail. And we have a lot of problems. There were several bills that the governor was not interested on it. And 3 of them were about protecting children with disabilities from the police. And that really upset me so much. There's another bill that really turned my stomach up and down. they had the Senate Bill 694, you didn't address them, but you were addressing the 763 about having all the religions in the church and all the preachers and all that stuff. Well, everybody has a different religion. So to me, that is not to me, it should not be. I love God and I go to church, I believe in God and everything. But then when they passed the Senate Bill 694, that bill, instead of getting the statute limitation higher up, they lowered the statute limitation for the victims of sexual abuse and the church.
Yeah,
And
thank you so much, Ms. Wilson, for those reflections. And just want to uplift. I mean, I think your point is exactly right on making sure that we, protect all students. The research is very clear on the impact of students with disabilities and the use of restraints, and appreciate the reflection around making sure that all kids are welcome in schools, just regardless of their religious identity. That's critically important. Thank you. Are there any other questions that we can address?
If not, and I'll go to the next slide, we can come back if anyone is putting anything in the chat. But we will, again, we're going to send this presentation out if you've registered today. And this does contain some other resource links. There's several resources that have been shared in the chat that are separate. And all of these are available on IDRA's website as well. But these are some targeted resources that we will be sharing this presentation. One is a school resource hub. So these are particular school resources and curriculum that can be used to teach affirming type of curriculum around students' identities. It's called We All Belong. And so you can find more information there. We're continuously updating it with more resources that either IDRA consultants and experts have developed or that come from other partners nationwide. We also do have our e-news, and I think this was just put in the chat as well to subscribe. We put out a variety of different types of resources that are either analysis or updates or special issue types of deep dives, whether it's on the NAEP scores or on censorship legislation or on Supreme Court case issues. But we encourage you to just subscribe to our e-news or just see past issues there. One of them is called Knowledge is Power. This is particularly around the K-12 censorship issues, and so I'm calling it out there for a variety of resources and bill analysis. We also have a few issue briefs that are included around school funding and school safety, infographics regarding private school vouchers, and guides, again, around classroom censorship. Many other resources on IDRA's website. We do encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter and for more information, but these will be contained in the presentation.
Go ahead, Ted.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if you could tell. So I asked for some help in the chat. It's probably not a question that you need to or even able to respond to immediately, but I do have a constituent request regarding basically and sort of an ethnic studies curriculum for Indigenous. So if you could take a look at what I left in the chat, and maybe let me know sometime, maybe next week. I would very much appreciate your feedback.
Yes, thank you so much. I was trying to read through that as quickly as possible. There have been there's an excellent pilot program that is ongoing, to my knowledge, in the Grand Prairie ISD area on American Indian Native Studies. Yes. Those would be the people, but I'm happy to connect you directly. So I'll follow up with you, Ted.
That would be great. I'd really appreciate that.
Awesome. Yeah, we did have, there was a push last August to get the really excellent work that's been cultivated out of that pilot program instituted statewide into our learning standards, as I think this request is getting at. And that got wrapped up in the State Board of Education's decision to move their review of social studies standards from last fall to 2025. So the pilot program still exists. It's still going, to my understanding, but that's why we don't have it in official state standards now, because of that previous decision from last year from the board.
And given the new board, that probably less likely now.
That was.
I'm just, that's just.
That was the thought. yeah, like, you know what, let's keep our pilot strong and grow it to some other groups. So I'll follow up with you directly. Thank you for that.
Okay, if there's no other questions, I haven't seen any in the chat. Going once, going twice. We'd just like to say thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. If you are, connected to or work within a school district or school system and want to talk more about implementation and any support you have around implementing any of these bills or compliance with these bills, please feel free to reach out. We'd love to hear from you about how you are thinking about them, struggling with them, implementing them. And thank you again to the many, many partners, advocacy and legislative and otherwise organizing that we see in this group. I know that it was a very long, very challenging legislative session. We know that there's much more to come this year in terms of educational justice, and deeply appreciate so many of you who are involved in this work and serving all of our kiddos in our public schools. And thank you, Chloe. I always learn so much from you.
Thank you, Paige. Thank you all.
Y'all have a great
Take
afternoon.
care.